Hey guys, tonight we dive into a world where parchment holds power, quills whisper lies, and the truth is just a flexible suggestion. You're sitting in a cold stone scriptorium, your fingers ink-stained and stiff. Candles flicker on wooden desks. The scent of beeswax and old vellum mixes with the musty breath of ancient books. Monks shuffle past in wool robes, muttering Latin as they carefully copy annals and gospels, or, depending on who's paying, subtly rewrite them. You're about to discover that fake news isn't some 21st century invention. It's been lurking in the shadows of monasteries for centuries. And tonight, you probably won't survive this scandalous scroll of deception. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you're listening. I love seeing how far this sleepy history spreads. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You kneel beside Brother Cadwin as he hunches over a folio. The air smells of dust and boiled fish. He's copying a royal charter. Or rather, he's making adjustments. See, the king's order was quite clear, but the monastery received a generous donation yesterday, and somehow the grant of land now favors the abbey. You squint as he smooths out a line. And let the tithes from the eastern fields. He scratches that and inserts western fields, which just happen to be more fertile. This isn't forgery, at least not in the criminal sense. It's clerical persuasion. In the Middle Ages, monks were the main gatekeepers of written information. Most nobles couldn't read more than their own name, and even that was questionable. So if monks said something was in the record, well, who could argue? One major example: the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that revered compendium of English history. Maintained by monks across various abbeys, it includes multiple versions, sometimes contradicting each other. The entry for 1052 reads like royal PR. Harold Godwin's son is depicted with saintly restraint, even when raiding. Some say this paints a picture deliberately slanted to justify his later claim to the throne. Historians still argue whether the scribes did this consciously, or if it was subconscious bias. Either way, you're reading history through a cracked lens. You follow Brother Cadwin to the margins of the manuscript. Tiny drawings hide there, doodles, some would call them. But not all are idle sketches. One shows a knight with a lion's head crushing a serpent, a symbol meant to represent a rival noble house. It's propaganda masquerading as religious art. Another margin features a nun chasing a fox, likely a jab at a recent scandal in a neighboring convent. Gossip, preserved in goat skin. As you move down the corridor, you hear low chanting. But it's not a hymn. It's a monk dictating a fabricated genealogy. The abbey's patron claims descent from Charlemagne. He isn't. But the parchment says otherwise, and you're watching that fact be born. Once inked, such claims become armor. Other nobles may scoff, but in a land where few can challenge ink with ink, the lie holds fast. Even more disturbingly, fabricated papal bulls occasionally circulated, granting privileges that no pope had ever approved. In 1059, for instance, an anonymous document known as the Donation of Constantine gave immense power to the Church, declaring the Pope supreme over all rulers in the West. Later, scholars exposed it as a forgery, but not until the 15th century. For 400 years, Europe ran on a lie. That's longer than America has existed. You wander now into a smaller room, dimly lit and warm with the heat of enclosed walls. A young novice is copying hagiographies, stories of saints. You notice Saint Ethelreda curing a man with leprosy by whispering into his nostril. Very specific. Another tale shows her floating 3 feet off the ground during prayer. Are these true? You whisper. The novice shrugs. It was in the older copy. And that's how it goes. One copy becomes the next, small exaggerations snowballing into official miracle lore. Pilgrimages are big business, after all. If your saint can't levitate or at least bleed from the eyes on command, what are you even doing? Of course, sometimes the lies serve darker purposes. In 1095, Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade relied on tales of atrocities, stories of Muslims desecrating Christian relics, defiling churches, and worse. Many of these were fabricated or grossly exaggerated. And yet, they were copied, spread, and preached. Fear is a powerful motivator, especially when it's illuminated with gold leaf. You find yourself back in the main hall, where two monks whisper near a stack of scrolls. One is editing the death notice of a prior abbot, removing the mention of questionable use of funds, and inserting called to heaven in a vision. You sigh? The truth dies quietly in the scriptorium, and still the ink flows. One particularly strange case involves a now-lost monastery in Normandy. According to an obscure 13th century source, the monks there claimed that Noah himself had passed through their valley after the flood, leaving behind a stone footprint and a vine that grew only clockwise. Naturally, they charged a small fee to see both. Historians still debate whether this account was a local satire, an outright scam, or just a monk having a little too much mead before Vespers. What's striking, you realize, is not that these deceptions happened, but that they were considered normal, expected, even. In a world without easy verification, the written word was an act of faith, and the ones doing the writing knew it. You tuck into a corner, wrapping your robe tighter against the evening chill. Outside, bells toll for Compline, but inside, the real sound is that slow, steady scratching of quill on skin. A whisper, a choice, a flourish, and history shifts again. You're still half asleep on a straw mat in the scriptorium when a parchment slips beside you. Its title written in bold black Latin, De Papa Femina. The story it tells is odd, unsettling, familiar, in a medieval soap opera sort of way. You blink groggily as a monk chuckles from the corner, mumbling, "Ah, the Lady Pope. That old chestnut. Meet Pope Joan, the Pope who, allegedly, wasn't a pope at all, because she was a woman." Now, depending on which version you stumble into, the story shifts. One says she was an Englishwoman. Another claims she was German. All versions agree she disguised herself as a man, joined the church, and rose through the ranks on the strength of her wit and theological brilliance. Eventually, she became pope, for 2 years, until, inconveniently, she gave birth in the middle of a public procession. Yeah, as you wander medieval streets in your imagination, the story follows you like a minstrel with a gossip addiction. Some versions say she died in childbirth. Others claim she was stoned to death by the furious crowd. A few spare details, like the baby surviving and being ordained, start feeling like fan fiction. And yet, this tale really stuck. For centuries, historians still argue whether Pope Joan ever existed. Most say probably not. Her story didn't appear in any official papal records until the 13th century, and even then, it was tucked into a chronicle known for entertaining more than enlightening. But oh, did it entertain? Church officials tried scrubbing the legend, but you know how that goes. Deny something too much, and suddenly everyone believes it. In fact, the legend grew so persistent that during papal processions in the later Middle Ages, popes would consciously avoid certain streets in Rome said to be cursed by her memory. An oddly specific detour for a person they insist never existed. The weirdest part? There was an actual chair involved. You sit now in the corner of a Roman church, squinting at a peculiar object. The sedia sterceraria, a marble seat with a strategically placed hole. According to whispers, future popes had to sit on it while a cardinal peered underneath to verify the, papal plumbing. Vir est, the examiner would say solemnly. It is a man. Officially, this ritual never happened. Unofficially, you're not so sure. You rub your temples. Whether Joan was real or not, her story revealed something very real. Public distrust of the church. A desire to believe that its highest power could be fooled by a woman in disguise. It was scandal, rebellion, and bedtime story rolled into one. By the 15th century, the tale was widespread. Protestant reformers loved Pope Joan. Martin Luther supposedly referenced her in a rant against Catholic corruption. Even the papacy can be fooled, he basically shouted, between fits of angry German. What makes her story endure isn't truth, it's narrative gold. The deception, the rise, the dramatic reveal. It checks every box. And it shows just how eagerly people in the Middle Ages wanted to believe certain lies. Not because they were gullible, but because the lies said something deeper, something emotional. You pass a tavern now, medieval air thick with smoke and ale. A bearded bard is retelling Pope Joan's story for coins and chuckles. But this time, he ends it differently. She survives, raises the baby, becomes a secret advisor to the next pope. The crowd applauds. Every retelling reshapes her. Sometimes tragic, sometimes clever. One scribe even claimed she was buried in disguise in a catacomb beneath Rome, next to early Christian martyrs. Another said her spirit haunts the Vatican library, whispering warnings to ambitious young clerks. That one's probably not in the official tour. You wonder, did someone make her up to discredit the church? Or was she based on a real woman? Her identity slowly melted into myth? Or maybe she was a satirical jab from monks who just had it with corrupt popes and wanted to poke the bear. No one knows. But isn't that the point? In a society where literacy was limited and oral storytelling ruled, truth bent easily to the needs of the crowd. A pope giving birth mid-parade is vivid. Shocking. It lingers in the mind long after dates and facts fade. Like modern fake news, it isn't about data, it's about drama. Now, imagine you're a teenager in the 14th century, wide-eyed as a traveling friar passes through your village and shares the tale by firelight. You've never seen Rome. You've never read a book, but you have seen men lie. And this story? It feels plausible, maybe even satisfying. That's the danger and allure of a good medieval falsehood. Once it gets cozy in your brain, it doesn't like to leave. Back in the scriptorium, a different monk glances over the parchment you found. Still reading about Joan, are we? He says. My uncle swore he met a bishop who swore she was real. But then again, that bishop also thought stars were angels with torches. You nod and set the parchment down. The ink is dry. The story is alive. You're back in the scriptorium, though now your focus shifts not to the words, but to the margins. Literally, you pick up a heavy psalter, its pages thick with gold leaf and reverence. But as your fingers turn to a random folio, your eyes drift to the edges. There it is, a gleaming serpent curled around a shepherd's staff, a rabbit jousting on a chicken, a man holding. Is that a baguette like a sword? These aren't careless scribbles. They're part of a long medieval tradition of marginalia, and they're often just as false as any forged charter. Because sometimes, the lies are hiding not in the words, but beside them. One particular image catches your eye. A snarling dragon wrapped around a bishop's crozier, clearly labeled Witness to the Firestorm of Antioch. That battle took place during the First Crusade. No dragons were involved. Probably. But the way this is illustrated, with glossy scales, tiny armored soldiers in the background, and one priest gesturing like a dramatic wizard, makes it feel real. This wasn't unusual. Medieval illustrators loved inserting myth into reality. A chronicler describes an eclipse. The margin shows a demon eating the moon. A famine. There's a skeletal angel smacking peasants with a stick. It's fake news in illuminated form. Half commentary, half hallucination, but convincing if you've never left your village. Historians still argue whether these drawings were meant to be taken seriously or if they were more like visual footnotes. Was the dragon in Antioch a metaphor for Muslim armies? Or a bored monk's nod to a good dinner story? Hard to say, but for readers of the time, especially those who couldn't read Latin, the margins became their main source of truth. You tiptoe through the abbey library now, brushing your hands against shelves of bestiaries. These were medieval animal encyclopedias, and about 80% of their content is questionable. The basilisk, for instance, could apparently kill you just by making eye contact. The manticore had a lion's body, human face, and the voice of a trumpet, like a nightmare mixtape. The bonacon, famously, was a bull that defended itself by shooting flaming poop backward. Yes, you heard that right. But here's the thing. These creatures were cited, copied, illustrated over and over. Monasteries treated bestiaries not just as zoology, but theology. Every animal had a moral lesson. The unicorn represented purity. The pelican, Christ's sacrifice, because people thought it pecked open its own chest to feed its young. Ouch. So when fake news showed up in the margins, it wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was didactic. Don't be greedy, said the monkey with 2 bananas and no pants. Trust God, whispered the bear teaching its cubs to walk on 2 legs. And if you were a peasant seeing this for the first time, you'd nod slowly, mouth slightly open, convinced that somewhere in the Alps, a lion really was befriending a widow. Now imagine this. A lord commissions a manuscript for his family. The monk copyist, eager to impress, fills it with not just scripture, but vivid creatures, noble deeds, and the occasional, let's say, revision. Like adding a scene where the Lord's grandfather single-handedly slays a wild boar while quoting the Psalms. That never happened, but the kids eat it up. That's how family legends are born. And in time, they're accepted as fact. One of the more delightful fringe stories involves a manuscript in which a snail repeatedly fights knights. You flip the pages. Snail. Knight. New snail. New knight. Nobody knows why this became a trend in 13th century manuscripts. Some say it symbolized cowardice. Others think it mocked slow legal processes. A few brave souls suggest monks were just having a laugh. The snails win more often than not, by the way. Now, you wander into a room where stained glass glows with late afternoon sun. And there, among the saints, is a scene of St. George battling the dragon. Of course, the dragon. You've heard this story since you were little. But here's the kicker. It was probably made up long after George's death, based loosely on earlier myths and mashed together with local folklore. Still, the tale served a purpose. It rallied the faithful. It justified chivalry. It became legend, then doctrine, then stained glass window. The original George, if he existed, might have just been a Roman soldier who got martyred. But hey, giant dragon battle sounds cooler. You find yourself chuckling as you pull out a copy of the Travels of Sir John Mandeville. A medieval bestseller, it described his alleged journey through Jerusalem, India, and even places like the land of dog-headed men. The book was filled with straight-up fiction, but people believed it. Why? Because it felt real enough. He described local customs, flora, maps, but also cannibal tribes, headless people, and birds that flew in pairs and killed you with their screams. Spoiler, Sir John probably never left England. Yet his work was copied, translated, and revered. Margins again featured illustrations to match, giving life to lies. A man holding his face on his chest. A camel with two heads and one opinion. Fake news, once more, traveling via Illuminated wing. What all this reveals is that truth in the Middle Ages wasn't just about fact. It was about story. If something supported faith, reinforced power, or entertained villagers, it got preserved. That sketch of the Pope with angel wings in the margin? It wasn't real, but it made the sermon feel truer. You glance again at the dragon around the bishop's crozier. You smile, because somewhere in history, someone believed it. And that, for a time, made it real. The road to Jerusalem is dusty, loud, and absolutely teeming with bad information. You walk alongside a troop of sweaty crusaders, some armored, some barefoot, all armed with more rumors than rations. It's the late 11th century, and Pope Urban II has just promised that anyone who joins this holy journey to the East will receive full forgiveness of sins. But the details of why, how, and what they'll find there, well, let's just say the medieval information highway has a few potholes. You stop at a campfire. A grizzled soldier with half a mustache is telling a tale. According to him, the Turks in Antioch drink Christian blood, worship golden donkeys, and keep relics from St. Peter's beard. His audience gasps. You squint. Where did he even hear this? Answer. Probably from someone who heard it in a sermon. The First Crusade was a factory for weaponized misinformation. The church needed people to sign up, and while faith was a strong motivator, a bit of moral panic helped too. Preachers exaggerated or outright fabricated atrocities committed by Muslims. Churches across Europe echoed these stories. In some places, they claimed that desecrated altars still bled. In others, they warned of Christians being roasted alive in bronze bulls. Historians still argue whether these stories were consciously invented or simply exaggerated over time. But what's clear is that the average crusader had a mental picture of the enemy that was almost mythological. Demonic faces, fire-breathing horses. One account even claimed Muslim armies were accompanied by invisible spirits of darkness. You listen to a knight describe a battle where the Virgin Mary appeared mid-fight and threw stones at the enemy. Everyone nods, including the friar who's been documenting the journey in Latin. Will this make it into the official chronicle? Absolutely. A particularly spicy tale involves the Holy Lance, the very spear that pierced Christ's side. According to a visionary crusader named Peter Bartholomew, the relic was buried beneath a church in Antioch. Conveniently, He had a vision revealing the exact spot. So they dug, and lo and behold, found a rusty spearhead. Miracle. Morale soared. Historians today are a tad skeptical. The whole thing smells like desperation mixed with dirt and hope. But the important thing was that people believed it. And so the march continued. You trudge behind a young scribe whose job is to document these events for the folks back home. He's sketching images in a little vellum book. You glance over his shoulder. A haloed knight fights off Saracen devils, while angels rain arrows from above. Not exactly the gritty reality of foot rot and botched strategy. But again, truth bends to the pen. Even the logistics got mythologized. One popular tale claimed that the Crusaders' food never ran out because their bread baskets were blessed to refill every morning. Another insisted that an army of white-clad saints appeared in the sky before the siege of Jerusalem. These weren't just comforting fantasies. They were spiritual proof that the cause was righteous. And of course, relics multiplied like rabbits. One night, you meet claims to carry a vial of Christ's tears. Another says he's got Mary's fingernail. You try not to ask questions. The further you go, the more everyone seems to be lugging holy objects that may or may not be real. A particularly proud bishop insists his chalice was made by Joseph of Arimathea himself. No one challenges him. It's heavy, probably brass, and he nearly drops it every time he tries to toast. You overhear a merchant swearing that his cousin met a crusader who spoke with a talking relic, a femur bone that gave battle advice. Allegedly, it had a high-pitched voice and said things like, "Hit them in the ankles." Useful. By now, the line between faith and fabrication has worn thin. A chronicler you chat with confesses that sometimes he just writes what the crowd wants to hear. What's the harm, he shrugs. It lifts the spirit. And besides, if enough people believe it, it must be true. That phrase follows you as you arrive in Jerusalem. The city is tense. Skirmishes, starvation, and political wrangling have taken their toll. But in the final assault, the chroniclers go into overdrive. One declares that 70,000 enemies were slain in a single day. Another claims the blood reached knee-high. Even modern historians with a taste for drama raise their eyebrows at that. Most say those numbers were wildly inflated, possibly by a factor of 10 or 20, or, maybe just completely made up. Still, the imagery stuck. Blood up to the ankles. Holy vengeance. Triumphant hymns. You walk quietly through the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The frescoes show the Crusaders kneeling in victory. The actual air smells of sweat and wax. You know the real story is more complicated, full of fear, disease, and whispered deals, but the walls don't tell that version. They tell the one with radiant halos and decisive battles. Even after the war ends, the fake news rolls on. Back in Europe, troubadours sing of dragon battles and evil wizards from the east. Chronicles appear claiming that relics glowed in the dark or whispered Latin prayers when touched. Whole towns build shrines based on these tales. Pilgrims walk hundreds of miles to see splinters of the true cross, of which there were enough pieces circulating to build a decent-sized boat. By the time you sit in a French tavern 5 years later, the crusade has transformed into a near-mythic memory. And all the inaccuracies, the relics, the visions, the battlefield miracles, have become holy footnotes. You sip a mug of wine, lean back, and realize the journey to Jerusalem was paved with fake news. But everyone made it holy anyway. You wake to the sound of alarm bells, an urgent clang, echoing through stone streets and empty market stalls. It's the middle of the night in Dijon, France, and the townspeople are panicking. Whispers rush faster than feet. An army is coming. You wrap a cloak around your shoulders and hurry up the slope to the city wall, where guards squint nervously into the darkness. A row of torches flickers across the fields outside town. Metallic glints. Movement. Weapons. Except something's off. You blink, and there they are. Soldiers. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. They stand stiffly in formation. But they aren't moving. At all. Dijon is under attack by scarecrows. This, you learn, is the tale of the Phantom Army of Dijon, a bizarre case of military misinformation and tactical theater from the Hundred Years' War. During a French-Burgundian standoff in 1360, the citizens of Dijon were low on men and supplies. They had no hope of surviving a siege. So they did the next best thing. They faked one. With borrowed armor, stuffed tunics, and a bit of creative rigging, they created the illusion of a full defending army. Dummy soldiers were posed behind battlements. Torches were positioned behind them to cast long, ominous shadows. Drums beat at intervals, echoing through the hills. And at just the right moment, they rang the bells. It worked. The approaching enemy, the English under Edward III, reportedly hesitated. Spies saw what they believed was a heavily fortified defense and advised against engagement. Whether the Scarecrow troops alone scared them off is debated, but Dijon wasn't taken. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate ploy or an exaggerated legend. Some suggest the story was later embellished to save face for the retreat. Others say local monks recorded the whole thing almost gleefully, relishing the idea that straw men had protected their sacred city. You now walk along the wall by lantern light, peering down where those stuffed warriors once stood. You can almost picture the townspeople scrambling, dressing wooden frames in rusted armor, slapping helmets on sacks of barley. One chronicler wrote that the soldiers never moved, but always looked ready, which is exactly what you want if you're too tired to actually fight. This wasn't the only case of phantom warfare in the Middle Ages. Throughout the era, fake armies, forged letters, and ghostly apparitions were tools of the trade. In one battle between rival lords in northern Italy, a commander claimed to have summoned angels who would fight beside him. Conveniently, those angels could not be seen, unless you had faith. Fake maps were also in fashion. A Norman duke once sent a revised map to a neighboring baron showing that a river had shifted its course, putting a disputed piece of land conveniently inside his territory. The map was not only incorrect, it was impossible, but the baron couldn't read, so checkmate. You step into a small council chamber now, where a mayor examines a wax-sealed letter delivered by a breathless messenger. The letter claims that reinforcements are en route from Paris. The mayor sighs. He's heard this before. Truth is, no one's coming. But if the people believe the lie, maybe they'll keep morale long enough for help to actually arrive. This was the strange calculus of medieval leadership. Sometimes, a well-placed lie could save hundreds of lives. Of course, sometimes it could also start a war. Another favorite tale from the era tells of a siege in southern France, where defenders painted pigs white, tied candles to their backs, and let them run loose in the hills at night. Seen from afar, they looked like ghosts. The attackers reportedly fled in terror, believing the dead had risen to defend the town. Again, historians are split. But you want it to be true. Just imagine the candle-lit pigs squealing through the moonlight, scattering soldiers who'd rather fight men than glowing bacon apparitions. Meanwhile, in Spain, forged royal decrees were used as tactical weapons. A general once produced a scroll signed by the king ordering his rival to stand down. It was fake, but the rival, unsure of the king's favor, complied, just long enough for the general to ambush his troops. Cold, but effective. You pass through a blacksmith's yard, where a young apprentice is hammering armor, not for soldiers, but for mannequins. He looks up sheepishly. They don't move, but they shine. That's the point, you realize. Shiny metal equals strength. Enough glitter, and no one asks how many people are actually inside the armor. These illusions weren't just visual. Sound played a big role, too. Empty barrels rolled down cliffs mimicked cavalry charges. Church bells rung out false signals. A rumor would spread that the Danes are coming, and peasants would flee before anyone even checked the road. It all reminds you of a strange hybrid between medieval warfare and community theater. And speaking of theater, a wandering troupe you meet later claims they once dressed as demons to scare off mercenaries threatening their town. They wore goatskins, painted their faces, and shouted nonsense from rooftops. It worked. The mercenaries didn't attack. One actor confesses, "I still use the same makeup for Easter plays." Eventually, the line between lie and legend erodes. Some towns start putting their phantom defenders on their official seals. Others install statues commemorating battles that never happened. One even holds an annual festival celebrating the day the dummies saved Dijon. You sip meat at the celebration, surrounded by men in sackcloth armor and kids poking each other with broom-handle swords. The crowd cheers as the mayor reenacts the night of the fake army. It's all absurd, and it's all real now. Because once the fear fades and the war ends, the story becomes something softer, something proud. The lie, retold with a smile, becomes tradition. And tradition, as you've learned, is just very old fake news dressed in velvet and song. Tonight the stars are unusually bright. You lie on your back in the grass beside a medieval castle, staring up at the constellations as a court astrologer mumbles predictions beside you. He has a beard that could hide small rodents and eyes that sparkle with secret knowledge, or maybe just wine. His scrolls are filled with circles, symbols, and Latin you definitely can't read. But he reads the stars, and that makes him important. Very important. Because in the Middle Ages, if you could align a few planets and mutter the right omen, you could influence kings. This man beside you, let's call him Master Odric, serves a duke. But he's no mere stargazer. He's a political asset. The duke wants to go to war, but can't say it's because he's bored or needs gold. No, he needs a celestial excuse. So Odric flips through his ephemerides and finds it, a Mars-Saturn opposition. He clears his throat dramatically. The signs speak of righteous conquest. And just like that, the campaign is justified. Swords drawn, taxes raised, peasants thoroughly unimpressed. You chuckle softly. It's hard to overstate how influential astrology was in the medieval world. You weren't supposed to make big decisions without consulting the heavens. Marriage, war, travel, even when to plant turnips. The stars had opinions, apparently. You follow Odric to the castle tower, where a bronze astrolabe swings from a chain. It looks like a complicated cheese grater, but he swears it helps calculate moon phases. You watch him line up the rings. Ah, he says, a perfect time for signing treaties. He's already written one. Just in case. Historians still debate whether astrologers like Odric believed their own predictions or simply played along. Some were devout in their calculations. Others adjusted their readings based on who was paying. A favorable horoscope for a noble? That'll cost extra. In 1186, a rare planetary alignment caused panic across Europe. Astrologers declared it the harbinger of apocalyptic war. Kings postponed travel. Bishops held mass. Commoners stocked up on salted fish and said tearful goodbyes to their goats. The world, of course, did not end. But fake news from the stars carried weight. Sometimes dangerously so. You visit the court of Charles VI of France. It's 1392. Charles believes his astrologers implicitly. When they say danger looms on a hunting trip, he panics. They say an enemy will betray him. He becomes paranoid. And when he finally snaps, riding into a rage and killing several of his own men, some blame the bad stars. Others blame the astrologers. Either way, no one questions the charts. Astrology wasn't just a tool for individuals, it was statecraft. Royal courts had official astrologers, much like a modern cabinet minister. These celestial consultants were consulted for coronations, treaties, and occasionally romantic affairs. One astrologer claimed the moon was in a fertile sign, which somehow meant the queen should conceive that night. We won't ask for details. Even medicine got tangled up. Physicians often consulted star charts before surgeries or bloodletting. You stroll past an apothecary, and he shows you his zodiac man, a delightful woodcut of a naked dude with astrological signs mapped all over his body. Apparently, you shouldn't lance a boil on your shoulder during Aries. Better wait for Pisces. Who knew? One quirky tidbit. A 14th century astrologer wrote a guide for farmers that included advice like, don't shear sheep when the moon is in Scorpio, lest they grow melancholy. You whisper this to a passing shepherd. He nods solemnly. Explains a lot, he says. Some predictions became self-fulfilling. A duke is warned of betrayal during the next lunar eclipse. So he grows suspicious, starts arresting advisors, maybe even executes a few. Eventually, someone rebels, not because the stars demanded it, but because the guy with the crown was acting like a paranoid goose. You climb a spiral staircase now to observe a secret meeting. A noblewoman is consulting her astrologer about her suitor. He draws the chart, frowns, and mutters something about Mars in retrograde. She dumps the suitor the next morning. The poor guy has no idea why. He just assumes she found out about the other girl. Which, to be fair, she also did. But the stars sealed it. And yet, the line between belief and manipulation was always blurry. In England, Henry VII reportedly backdated his son's birth chart to align it with an auspicious conjunction, giving Prince Arthur a destined-to-rule vibe. It didn't work out, but the chart was persuasive at the time. You peek into a university lecture in Paris. A professor of astrology, yes, that was a real job, points at a diagram showing how Jupiter's position affects political stability. His students nod and take notes. Some of these same students will go on to advise kings. But not everyone was fooled. You pass a tavern where two peasants drink stale cider and mock the duke's star priest. One mutters, "If Mars is always angry, maybe Mars just needs a nap." The other burps in agreement. Most commoners had their own brand of wisdom, rooted more in weather and crops than planetary alignments. Still, astrology's influence persisted. You visit a monastery where monks track lunar eclipses to predict when heretics might rise. One friar swears he saw a face in the moon last week. It said repent, or maybe ferment. He's not sure. Perhaps the most peculiar example you find is an English noble who refused to bathe on Tuesdays because Venus was in a jealous aspect. His court learned to live with the smell. Eventually, astrology's grip would loosen. By the 17th century, new science would scoff at retrogrades and rising signs. But in the medieval mind, the sky wasn't just decoration, it was direction. And as long as stars glimmered and kings worried, someone like Odric would always be there, whispering the right omen at the right time, usually for the right price. You find yourself trudging along a winding dirt road with sore feet and a sore sense of purpose. Around you, hundreds of fellow travelers march forward, some barefoot, some limping, some humming quietly. It's pilgrimage season, and the road to Compostela, Canterbury, or Cologne is packed. But you're not here for penance. You're here for the relics. And let's be honest, they're probably fake. Relics, in the medieval imagination, are holy treasures with extraordinary power. Bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, vials of Jesus' blood, feathers from angel wings, you name it. The idea is this: touch the sacred, receive a blessing. Or, at the very least, bragging rights back home. But the truth, as you soon discover, is a little more fragmented. At a dusty stall near a church, a rosy-cheeked merchant offers you a tooth. "Saint Apollonia," he whispers. She's the patroness of dental pain. You squint at the oddly white molar wrapped in velvet. It looks suspiciously fresh. But before you can ask questions, he adds, "Only 3 left." Further up the road, another seller proudly displays a feather from the Archangel Gabriel's wing. You tilt your head. It's a chicken feather, dyed blue. He shrugs. "Holy poultry," he insists. Historians estimate that by the 14th century, there were enough nails from the true cross to arm a small navy, enough Virgin Mary's milk to fill a bathtub, and at least 4 heads of John the Baptist, sometimes in the same country. Even medieval scholars scratched their tonsured heads. "How can this be?" one asked. "Easy," another replied. "Miracles." You arrive at a grand cathedral where lines snake around the nave. The faithful wait to see a saint's finger bone displayed in a golden reliquary. Inside the case, the bone gleams like ivory. But here's the twist: the saint died in Syria. This bone came from a Roman catacomb. Shipped, renamed, repackaged. Was it fraud? Maybe. But it was also survival. Monasteries and churches competed fiercely for pilgrims, and relics brought traffic. Traffic meant donations. Donations meant repairs, tapestries, and maybe even a new bell tower. So when a rival abbey claimed they had St. Hubert's kneecap, you suddenly discovered his shin bone in your cellar. Imagine that. Some relics were stolen. A lot were traded. Many were invented. One famous case: the monks of Vézelay claimed to have Mary Magdalene's remains. But so did the monks of St. Maximin la Saint-Baume. And both monasteries had papal paperwork saying they were right. One side eventually dug up a tomb, found bones, and held a huge ceremony. The other just doubled down. Historians still argue whether either site had even a hint of authenticity. But for centuries, pilgrims wept at both. You sit now beside a tired friar who's spent the day blessing strangers with a relic said to be a splinter from the manger of Christ. It's tiny, reddish, and smells like cinnamon. You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. "The point," he says, "is that they believe." And honestly, he's not wrong. Because whether or not the bones, fabrics, and crumbs were genuine, they offered hope. Healing. Stories. You meet a woman who claims her goiter vanished after touching St. Cuthbert's shoe. A knight says his son recovered from a fever after sleeping with a splinter of St. Edmund's staff under his pillow. Did it happen? Who knows? But the believing helped. Then there were the miracle fakes. One town claimed their relic glowed in the dark. Visitors were amazed. Later, it turned out the relic was lit from behind by a hidden lantern. Another claimed their relic cried. A helpful monk refilled the tear duct each night with a dropper. When exposed, the monk reportedly said, "Well, it worked, didn't it?" A particularly bold story comes from Cologne, where a chalice was said to refill itself with wine. People came from miles. But a visiting monk accidentally discovered a hollow base and a very sweaty altar boy with a siphon tube. You try not to laugh. One relic trend that takes you by surprise? Body doubles. Some saints were in such demand that pieces of them were divided and spread across Europe like souvenir keychains. Finger here, jaw there, spine somewhere in Belgium. Theologians argued about this a lot. Was a relic still holy if it was just a part? Could two churches each have half of the same skull? Eventually, some just made duplicates. It's the spiritual essence that matters. One bishop explains to you, while polishing a shiny glass he claims belonged to St. Lucy. The bone is just a carrier pigeon for holiness. You now stroll through a market in Santiago, where stalls sell fake relics to fake pilgrims. You can buy a toe bone, a shroud thread, or a vial labeled Tears of a Sinner. You open one. It smells like vinegar. Everyone knows it's fake. No one seems to care. Because in a world where truth is elusive and suffering is real, the relic, real or not, offers a physical connection to something greater. A promise of protection, a portable miracle. And perhaps the biggest irony? Many of these fakes became real over time. As they were venerated, touched, wept over, and enshrined, they absorbed authenticity through use. A pig bone mistaken for St. Jerome's elbow was, after centuries of reverent prayer, no longer just a pig bone. It was history, which, like relics, can be forged and still believed. You're deep in a village now, one of those nameless, muddy places with chickens underfoot and gossip in the air. The year is 1483. The harvest was bad, the priest is drunk again, and nobody's seen a merchant in weeks. So the locals turn to the only real form of news they have, whispers. And when whispers grow sharp, they cut. You perch on a barrel near the well as two women lean in close, voices low. "Marta's cow dried up again," one says. "Must be the widow in the woods. She looked at Marta crossways last Thursday." You nod slowly. Of course, it's the widow's fault. Or so it's said. Tonight's subject? Witchcraft, whisper networks, and how fake news fueled some of the most destructive panics in medieval Europe. You stand silently in the square as the village elder posts a notice on a splintering door. It's not official law. It's a concerned message. It warns villagers to avoid any contact with certain people. Their names are unspoken, but everyone knows. They're the ones who've been accused, unofficially, of causing illness, crop failure, or a sudden spate of nosebleeds. Here, fear spreads faster than fact, and rumors are policy. You walk through the wheat fields where young girls gather herbs. They giggle about a local story. Old Agnes turned a man into a toad. Of course, the man denies it, but he does have a limp and croaks when he laughs. Coincidence? Or witchcraft? Historians still debate whether these stories started as satire, superstition, or social control. But in tightly knit communities with little formal education, gossip was the media. If enough people said it, it became true. Or at least actionable. Take the case of the Witch of Eris. A widow, poor and childless, was accused when 3 children got fevers. A few sheep died. Someone claimed she looked at their firewood and it smoked funny. Before long, she was on trial. They found a witch's mark on her shoulder, most likely a mole. She was hanged. Later records revealed her neighbor wanted her land. You sit at the back of a courtroom now, watching a trial. A young girl testifies that she saw the accused dancing in the woods at night. "With cats," she adds solemnly. The judge nods. That's more than enough. The real horror isn't that people believe these things. It's how quickly they did. You overhear a priest explaining that a woman once sneezed in church 3 times on a Sunday, and then the river flooded. Clearly connected. Another claims to have read a book that proves witches can fly, provided they boil bat fat and chant backwards in Latin. You make a mental note not to sneeze. Meanwhile, a book known as the Malleus Maleficarum is spreading. It's the ultimate witch-hunting manual, written by a couple of very, very intense monks. It claims that women are more likely to be witches because they are weaker in faith and easily seduced by demons. Convenient. Also, wildly unscientific. This book becomes the medieval equivalent of a viral post. It's copied, passed around, whispered about. And even when it's questioned, the damage is already done. You duck into a candlelit cottage where a midwife cradles her herbs. She's next on the list. Not because she's done anything, but because she knows how to do things. Healing, birthing, brewing. Too much knowledge equals suspicious. One village woman says she once heard her mutter dark words while grinding poppy seed. She was probably just saying, "Please don't let this baby come breech." In nearby towns, black cats vanish. Horses are painted with chalk sigils. Children wear garlic around their necks. A man sells witch detectors, which are just pointy sticks. One curious case from Bohemia involves a town that accused 3 women of stealing the moon. That's right, the actual moon. According to reports, it vanished from the sky for a night. An eclipse. But no one knew that. So, clearly, witchcraft. The women were tortured. 2 confessed. The 3rd bit the torturer's nose. Mixed results. Fake news in witch trials was particularly potent because it didn't need evidence. It only needed repetition. One child said she saw a woman walk through a wall. The rest agreed. No one checked the wall. You join a nighttime procession where villagers walk in circles to ward off sky witches. They hum tunelessly. One man blows a horn fashioned from a sheep's thigh bone. Another sprinkles salt around his shoes. A third insists his sister was once turned into a hedgehog but got better. Eventually, witch trials get official backing. Towns send for inquisitors. They arrive with paperwork, grim expressions, and loaded questions. When did you first consort with demons? Not did you. When? You're watching a machine designed to confirm what it already believes. And behind every accusation, a grudge, a land dispute, a child that didn't recover. You meet a scholar in Prague who tries to push back. He publishes a pamphlet arguing that witches are simply misunderstood or victims of illness. The pamphlet is burned. He is not, but he's reassigned to beekeeping. For life. And still, the whispers grow. The widow who collects feathers? Witch. The baker whose bread never burns? Witch. The orphan girl with red hair and no freckles? Witch. You look around the village and realize the line between suspicion and fact no longer exists. And the more absurd the story, the more it sticks. Because people don't want logic. They want explanation. And in the vacuum of truth, fear steps in, dressed in cloaks, armed with pointy sticks, ready to cleanse what it doesn't understand. You leave the village as dawn breaks, smoke curling from chimneys. A new rumor is already forming. Someone saw a raven fly backward. You close your eyes. Another trial is coming. The cradle rocks gently, but something doesn't feel quite right. You're in a royal chamber now. Thick velvet curtains, the scent of lavender and melted beeswax, and the unmistakable tension of a secret barely contained. The baby in the cradle has golden curls and royal swaddling. But rumor has it, this child may not be who everyone thinks it is. Tonight, you're diving into royal baby scandals, phantom heirs, and baby swaps. Those moments when dynasties turned on whispers and bassinets. You linger by the fire, where a lady-in-waiting murmurs to another. She wasn't showing just a week ago. Pregnancy timelines are tricky, especially when queens vanish from public view for months, and then emerge holding a suspiciously large infant. Or worse, twins, when everyone expected one. Some chalk it up to divine blessing. Others start counting backwards. The stakes are astronomical. In a world where bloodlines rule nations, a royal baby isn't just a child, it's power incarnate. And when that child's identity is questioned, entire kingdoms shake. Take the case of Edward VI, son of Henry VIII. Born in 1537, his mother, Jane Seymour, died soon after childbirth. Some fringe writers later suggested the child was too perfect, quiet, healthy, and suspiciously clean for a newborn. A few even proposed that the real prince had died and been swapped with a commoner baby. No evidence ever proved it, but the story lived on, whispered in inns and scribbled in margins. Further back, in the 12th century, you find the tragic tale of William Audlin, heir to Henry I of England. After his death in a shipwreck, rumors swirled that he had survived and gone into hiding. Decades later, a man appeared claiming to be William, returned to reclaim his throne. Historians still argue whether he was a fraud or simply a tool for rebellious nobles. But by far, the most spectacular case of baby-related misinformation is the tale of the Pauper Prince, a rumor that shook France. It begins with the death of Louis XVII, the young son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Officially, he died in prison during the French Revolution, aged just 10. But conspiracy theories bloomed like dandelions. Some believed the royalists smuggled him out. Others swore the body buried was not the prince's at all. Suddenly, dozens of Louis XVII's appeared across Europe. Tailors, monks, shoemakers. One even ran a bakery. Each claimed to be the lost heir. A few gained followers. One even secured an audience with a German duke. DNA tests centuries later confirmed the child in the grave was likely Louis, but that didn't stop the myth. People needed to believe their monarch had escaped. You slip into the court of 14th century Portugal now, where King Pedro I famously declared that his murdered mistress, Inés de Castro, had given him legitimate children. After her death, he exhumed her body, dressed her in royal robes, and forced courtiers to kiss her hand. A deeply theatrical form of posthumous gaslighting, but effective. Their children were recognized. More often, though, the fake news came from below the throne. Peasant revolts occasionally featured self-proclaimed lost princes who claimed they were hidden away at birth, swapped by conniving midwives, and raised in secret. These stories struck deep because they offered a fantasy that anyone might secretly be royal, that bloodlines were fragile, that the world might be turned upside down with the right bedtime tale. You now stand in a nursery in Venice, where a nanny rocks a cradle while whispering that the baby inside has two mothers. Not metaphorically, literally. The merchant's wife couldn't conceive, so they paid a servant to bear the child, then claimed it as their own. It's hushed up, of course, but years later, a midwife breaks the silence, and the heir is exiled. A fringe account from Germany tells of a baroness who faked a pregnancy by stuffing her belly with wool, then miraculously produced a child 9 months later. Unfortunately, she forgot to bribe the midwife. The entire affair unraveled over cake and wine. You sit at a royal baptism where gifts are lavish, but smiles are tight. The rumors swirling say the child was born of a different father, an affair covered up with speed and silks. A chronicler writes carefully, "The child bore little resemblance to the king, save the crown upon his brow." Ouch! Sometimes, royal babies were hidden for their own safety. During the Wars of the Roses, Edward V and his brother Richard were taken to the Tower of London and never seen again. What happened? No one knows. Some believe they were murdered. Others believe they survived and lived under false names. Later, 2 pretenders appeared claiming to be them, Perkin Warbeck being the most famous. Was he an actor? A tool? Or just maybe one of the real boys? Historians still argue. But you stand at the tower walls now, imagining the silence of those stone rooms and the enormity of what might have been lost or concealed. Even when truth was later uncovered, the stories often stuck. People preferred the romantic version, the swapped prince, the hidden heir, the noble child raised among peasants, because those tales spoke to longing, to order and justice and fate, and to the hope that a kingdom, like a baby, might be saved by something or someone unexpected. So the cradle rocks on, and no one's quite sure who's inside. You're sitting at a long trestle table in a smoky medieval tavern, watching a man grind emeralds into powder. He sprinkles the shimmering dust into a goblet of wine, stirs it with a wooden spoon, and downs it like a hero in a bard's tale. Around him, peasants cheer. "Plague-proof now," he says proudly, wiping his mouth on a sleeve that hasn't seen soap since last Easter. Tonight, we sip our way into the strange world of fake plague cures, homebrewed concoctions, miracle tonics, and misinformation that spread even faster than the Black Death. When the bubonic plague hit Europe in the 14th century, panic quickly outpaced understanding. Germ theory wouldn't show up for another 500 years. People didn't know what caused it, so they blamed everything: miasmas, sin, bad luck, Jews, comets, or sometimes just Mondays. And into that fearful void rushed a flood of false remedies. You walk through a bustling marketplace, dodging coughs and carts, until you reach a stall with guaranteed plague shield scrawled in crooked letters. The vendor offers you a small linen pouch filled with dried rose petals, wormwood, and bits of unicorn horn. You raise an eyebrow. Very rare, he assures you. 3 unicorns died for this. You're pretty sure it's chalk and rabbit bone. One of the most popular cures was smelling things. People believed the plague was carried by bad air, so they clutched pomanders, little scent balls filled with herbs, or wore flower-stuffed masks. That's how we got the now iconic image of plague doctors with bird-like beaks. Inside those beaks, rose petals, mint, camphor, and cloves. They weren't diagnosing anything, just trying to outsmell death. You visit a noble's estate where servants boil vinegar and onions all day, believing the fumes will purify the air. In one room, you find a man lying under a blanket of crushed marigolds. Another is being whipped as penance, convinced the plague is God's punishment. It's working, he wheezes. Some of the remedies were wildly elaborate. In Germany, a recipe called for mixing snake flesh, saffron, and treacle, cooking it under a full moon, and reciting 3 psalms backwards. The result was a thick sludge the color of regret. People sold it by the spoonful. Then there were bloodlettings. Barbers, yes, barbers, would cut open veins to release the bad humors. You sit beside a pale apprentice being drained like a wineskin. He passes out. His barber says it's a good sign. In Venice, the government tried to crack down on fake cures, but the charlatans always found a way. One claimed he could summon demons to carry the disease away. Another said you should bury a toad alive with a clove of garlic and then dance around the grave for 7 days. The toad absorbs the poison, he explained. The toad was unavailable for comment. Historians still debate how many of these remedies were sincere beliefs and how many were outright cons. Some were rooted in ancient medical theories, like balancing the 4 humors. Others were just snake oil in a pewter cup. But when bodies piled up and neighbors fell ill overnight, people were willing to try anything. You stroll past a tavern where a bard sings about a miracle drink made of goose fat and crushed emeralds. You wince, remembering the man you saw earlier. Goose fat was a favorite. People smeared it on boils, on doors, on bread. The emeralds? A dangerous addition. Shards could rip your insides to shreds. A merchant offers you a bottle of plague oil, guaranteed to seal the skin against pestilence. The ingredients? Olive oil, rosemary, crushed ants, and a splash of vinegar. He leans in, whispering. Also repels werewolves. 2-for-1 deal. Some tried diet-based cures. One monk insisted that eating only apples and sleeping on a board would prevent infection. Another wrote that drinking wine, only from silver goblets, and only if you sing psalms between sips, would shield the faithful. You imagine the resulting tavern choir, drunk, off-key, but enthusiastic. You meet a nun tending to the sick with a brew of garlic, honey, and pigeon blood. She says it was passed down by her abbess, who once cured a night of leprosy using only herbs and prayer. The nun has kind eyes. She offers you a taste. You decline politely. One strange remedy involved roasting a live chicken and placing it, still warm, on the afflicted person's boils. Supposedly, the chicken would absorb the disease. If the chicken died, it had done its job. If it lived, you probably needed another chicken. Or 2. Even royalty fell for bizarre cures. King Charles VI of France reportedly wore hot onions in his boots. Pope Clement VI sat between 2 enormous fires, believing the smoke would drive the plague away. It probably did more than they knew. Heat and smoke actually reduced fleas. But they didn't know that. They just liked the smell of burning logs and being sweaty in velvet. And let's not forget the 4 thieves' vinegar. Legend has it that during a major outbreak in Marseille, 4 thieves robbed the homes of the dead and dying, but never got sick. When caught, They offered their secret in exchange for leniency, a vinegar infused with herbs like rosemary, sage, lavender, and thyme. Was it true? Probably not. But the recipe spread like wildfire. Today, it's sold in herbal shops under the same name. You visit a village where a new miracle man has arrived. He claims he can see plague demons and banish them with chalk sigils and rhubarb smoke. His robe is shiny. His hair is suspiciously perfect. The townspeople gather around him, clutching coin and hope. He draws a circle, mutters some words, and waves a stick. The crowd applauds. A rooster crows. Somewhere, an actual doctor sighs into a bucket. But here's the thing. Even the fake cures sometimes worked, indirectly. Pomanders help people avoid crowded, smelly areas. Vinegar acted as a mild antiseptic. And anything that made people feel safer may have improved morale, and with it, survival. You settle beside a window as night falls and the air cools. Outside, someone lights incense. Another pounds garlic into paste. Another sings to a fig tree. The plague still lurks. But the people fight with whatever they've got. Because when knowledge fails, belief rushes in. And sometimes, belief is all you have. You arrive at a lavish medieval court, all silk and smugness, just as two kings shake hands over a peace treaty that doesn't exist. There's a feast tonight, roasted boar, honey-glazed fruit, and lots of performative grinning. But beneath the polished silver and carefully poured wine lies a strange secret. The entire negotiation is built on a fiction. No scroll was signed. No envoy dispatched. The treaty is a bluff. A ghost on parchment. A royal power play with the volume, turned all the way up. Tonight's tale is about phantom treaties and diplomatic fake-outs. How rulers lied to buy time, save face, or start wars, all while pretending they were playing by the rules. You stand beside a scribe scribbling furiously at a long table. His job? To forge an agreement between his king and a neighboring ruler. The terms? Reasonable. Grain shipments, a few border clarifications, a promise of no invasion until spring. The twist? The other side has no idea this treaty exists. It's for internal use only, to calm nobles and keep rebellious vassals in line. Historians still argue whether such tactics were strategic genius or reckless fraud. But in a world without mass media, rulers could get away with it, at least for a little while. One of the juiciest examples comes from the 13th century, during a tense standoff between the Holy Roman Empire and the Papal States. The emperor claimed the pope had agreed to withdraw troops from disputed lands. Papal envoys denied it, but the emperor presented a document bearing a papal seal. Fake, probably, but authentic-looking enough to buy him time. And by the time anyone could sort out the truth, he'd already seized the territory in question and appointed a bishop. The deed was done. You peek over the shoulder of another court official, carefully copying an old treaty, altering dates, names, and clauses. It's not lying, he mutters. It's strategic retroactive clarification. You nod solemnly. That sounds very official. One French king in the 15th century reportedly cited a secret treaty with England that no one else had ever seen. When pressured to produce it, he waved vaguely toward a fire. It was lost in the hearth incident. Very convenient. Almost as if that fire had suspiciously good timing. You now enter a dusty archive in a monastery, where monks preserve royal documents. Some are genuine, some less so. A forged land grant is tucked between two tax records, signed with an unfamiliar name, Chancellor Hubertus. No one remembers him, but the document has been cited 3 times in the last century. And each time, it tilted property rights just a little further toward the abbey. This wasn't limited to local disputes. In the late 14th century, a minor German prince claimed to be under protection of the King of Hungary. The Hungarians had never heard of him, but the prince had a scroll, sealed, stamped, and written in sloppy Latin. It was enough to deter a neighboring invasion. For 6 months. Then came a war. You pause by a court jester, lounging against a barrel of wine, who tells you about the Treaty of the Two Ducks. Apparently, 2 minor lords once negotiated a treaty using messenger ducks. When the ducks flew off in the wrong direction, both sides claimed the other had broken the agreement. War broke out over a joke with feathers. He's probably lying. But then again, maybe not. Sometimes, these phantom treaties were created to trick allies. You sit in on a royal council where one advisor warns, if we don't secure Bavaria, we'll lose the Alps. Another chimes in, but the king already has a pact with the Duke of Bavaria. Everyone relaxes. That pact doesn't exist. But now the court thinks the region is safe, and resources are redirected elsewhere. It's a confidence con. In a strange reversal, a 14th-century Italian city once fabricated a treaty it wanted to exist, then published it in hopes the other side would agree just to save face. The sheer audacity worked. The rival city said, yes, of course, that's what we meant all along, and trade resumed. You imagine two rulers bluffing like poker players with invisible cards. I have a treaty with Venice. So do I. Mine has a better seal. Mine's scented. And suddenly, everyone's acting based on a fiction no one actually believes, but no one dares challenge. Even coronations weren't immune. One English claimant produced a document proving he was promised the throne in a sealed pact between his grandfather and the previous king. Unfortunately, the seal matched one used only after the king's death. Whoops. But by then, swords had been drawn. Sometimes, phantom treaties weren't invented out of malice, but miscommunication. A scribe mistranslates a clause. 4 years of peace becomes 40. No tribute becomes half tribute. The result? One side thinks they're at war. The other is holding a feast. You join a noble at a banquet celebrating a renewed treaty. He leans over and admits quietly, we never signed anything. But the other side thinks we did, and they've stopped raiding. He raises his goblet. Long live confusion. Not all phantom treaties were lies. Some were hopeful drafts, and signed but whispered about until they became real by repetition. Like a rumor that gains form. One baron's squire claims to have seen the signed scroll. Another swears his uncle delivered it. Eventually, enough people believe it that leaders start acting accordingly. You now find yourself in a candlelit study, where an aging duke pens a letter to his son. Always leave room for ambiguity, he writes. A treaty not written is a treaty not broken. You feel a chill. That's not advice. That's strategy. Because in the Middle Ages, paper was power. But silence, cleverly wielded, was even better. And sometimes, the most effective treaty was the one that never existed. You slip into the back of a grand cathedral where incense floats like mist and Latin prayers echo off the stone. At the front, a bishop with a gold-threaded mitre raises his hands dramatically and begins a homily so florid you could swear you're listening to a theater audition. Then he begins to speak of his ancestry, not from peasants, not from nobles, but from angels. You lean forward. Tonight's tale is about bishops with bizarre backstories. Churchmen whose resumes include divine parentage, gladiator lineage, and the occasional talking fish. You trail this bishop, let's call him Ambrosius of Alls, into his quarters. The man is regal, educated, confident, and entirely convinced that his bloodline includes both Saint Michael and a Roman demigod. His family supposedly traces its roots to a union between a heavenly flame and a widow who lived by the sea. According to legend, his great-great-great-grandfather burst into the world fully formed, wearing sandals made of starlight. The bishop keeps a portrait of this radiant ancestor over the fireplace. It looks suspiciously like himself. You might assume this is satire or a local joke. But no, the story appears in 3 separate hagiographies. And while most scholars today chuckle at the absurdity, the account helped cement Ambrosius's authority in a diocese teetering on rebellion. Historians still debate whether such legends were created by the bishops themselves, their followers, or eager scribes trying to upgrade their bosses into myth. You stroll down a cloister walk lined with statues. One monk tells you of Bishop Wilfrid, who claimed to be the last surviving member of the Trojans. Yes, those Trojans. According to his tale, his ancestor fled the fall of Troy, settled in Gaul, and prophesied that one day, a descendant would bring divine balance to the church. Wilfrid took that to mean himself. When questioned by rival clergy, he reportedly said, "The proof is in my bearing." Hard to argue with that. Of course, some bishops went the other way, claiming dark or exotic origins to project mystique. In the court of Frederick II, you meet a bishop who whispers that he was raised by Saracen philosophers and bathed in knowledge and fire. That same bishop later banned 3 books and then rewrote them under his own name. Coincidence? You step into a coastal church in Cornwall, where Bishop Aemon is known for his communion with dolphins. Local legend claims he once fell off a ship during a storm and was carried to safety by a pod of glowing sea creatures. He later preached a sermon in which he said, "Even the ocean hears the voice of God and sings it back in waves." The sermon's transcript is widely copied and, oddly, even referenced by later theologians. Was it poetic metaphor? Or just very wet fake news? You now explore the tomb of Bishop Theodoric of Trier, said to have descended from Julius Caesar's illegitimate grandson. The story's weak on evidence, but rich in spectacle. Theodoric's seal includes laurel leaves, his motto is in Pseudo-Latin, and one chronicler described him as a man who walked with Rome at his back. The implication? Not just holy, but historically inevitable. Many of these fantastical origin stories had a purpose. In uncertain times, a bishop with a magical past could rally congregations, silence critics, and draw pilgrims. His story became his brand. And brand meant power. Some stories were clearly fabricated after the fact. A bishop who rose from humble beginnings might suddenly acquire a tale of angelic guidance at birth. A misshapen scar becomes the touch of St. Peter. A stormy baptism becomes a supernatural test. The farther back you go, the more miraculous it all gets. One baby bishop candidate reportedly didn't cry until his godfather quoted the Psalms. In Greek, you meet a scribe copying a Vita, one of those long, saintly biographies. Half of it is true, he says. The other half is divine encouragement. You ask what that means. He just smiles and dips his quill in ink. And then there's Bishop Imric of Carcassonne, whose official biography includes a section on firewalking. He supposedly passed barefoot over burning coals to prove his purity. One eyewitness said he smelled faintly of cinnamon afterward. Another suggested the coals were mostly embers. Still, the feat earned him a cathedral mural and a reputation for divine resilience. Back in England, you encounter a bishop whose parents were said to be giants. Literal ones. From the northern hills, a monk explains, where the sun rises red and the wolves speak prophecy. No one's ever found these talking wolves, but that didn't stop the bishop from including their tale in his family crest. A crimson wolf holding a lily. Even the church itself occasionally rolled with the myth. In disputed regions, Rome sometimes accepted outrageous backstories if the bishop in question was politically useful. One such candidate swore he was descended from a line of wandering Hebrew prophets. Another said he had stigmata from age 5 and once levitated during a thunderstorm. The records don't exactly confirm that, but they also don't deny it. You walk past stained glass windows, noticing how many bishops are depicted with halos, lightning bolts, or wings. Literal wings. One bishop in Spain is shown with eagle feathers and sandals of gold. His official biography describes him as borne aloft by the winds of truth. You're pretty sure that's not canon, but it sure looks good in glass. And when a bishop dies, the myths only grow stronger. A few decades later, a mole on his back becomes a divine sigil. His old walking staff, rotting in a closet, becomes a miracle rod. Someone finds a smudge on his robe that looks like the Virgin Mary. Pilgrims arrive within a week. Over time, it becomes harder to separate fact from fiction. The man who once walked the town square, yelled at pigeons, and forgot people's names becomes a gilded memory, half man, half legend. You rest beneath a carved stone effigy of Bishop Armandus the Radiant. He once claimed to be descended from a comet. You run your fingers over the inscription at the base. He came from the stars. He left as a son. Maybe. Or maybe he just came from the next village over and had a really good scribe. You're rocking gently on the open sea now, the salt breeze on your face, a gull overhead sounding vaguely annoyed at your presence. The crewmen around you are mostly silent, save for the sound of sloshing water and the rhythmic creak of oars. They're heading west, farther than they've ever gone before. At the helm stands a monk. His name is Brendan, and tonight, you follow the ripples of one of the most curious medieval claims of all, that a humble Irish monk crossed the Atlantic nearly 1,000 years before Columbus and found paradise. Also, talking birds, floating crystal islands, and possibly a sea monster that's just a really annoyed whale. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani, The Voyage of Saint Brendan, was one of medieval Europe's bestsellers. Copied, translated, and retold across centuries, it chronicled Brendan's 7-year journey across the Atlantic in search of the promised land of the saints. His ship? A leather-covered coracle. His map? Faith and a good breeze. You huddle beside a cowhide sail as the story unfolds. Brendan sets out with a group of fellow monks, all ready to embrace the unknown. Early on, they land on an island that turns out to be not an island. It's a giant fish named Jasconius, who is deeply unimpressed with their cook fire. Everyone screams. The island dives. And that's how their first miracle begins. Historians still argue whether Brendan's tale was allegory, misinterpretation, or an embellished memory of a real voyage. Some think he may have reached the Faroes or Iceland. Others insist it's pure holy fiction. But the descriptions are oddly compelling. One page describes crystal towers rising from the sea, possibly icebergs. Another mentions volcanic landscapes that belch fire and reek of sulfur. Could be Iceland again. And then there are islands of singing birds, which spend their days praising God in perfect harmony. A choir of seagulls? You want to believe. You stop now at a monastery scriptorium where a young monk copies Brendan's story by candlelight. Did he really go, you ask? He looks up, thoughtful. We believe he did. Or at least, we believe in what the journey means. Because Brendan's tale wasn't just a travelogue. It was a spiritual map, full of lessons disguised as locations. The Island of Temptation, where feasting leads to storms. The Isle of Silence, where no one speaks for 40 days. The Sea of Demons, where shadowy forms hurl rocks and curses. Each trial brought Brendan closer to paradise, and closer to the divine. It's not hard to see why the story caught fire. Medieval Europe, especially in the early Middle Ages, was isolated, fragmented, and hungry for wonder. Brendan's voyage offered both adventure and salvation. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a king. He was a man with a boat, a Bible, and blind faith. And somehow, that was enough to reach the edge of the world. You imagine the impact of this story on readers who had never seen the ocean. They'd hear tales of islands where angels passed overhead like comets, or shores lined with giant grapes, or fish that wept when monks sang psalms. And they believed, not because it was logical, but because it was beautiful. Over time, maps began to reflect Brendan's journey. A few even placed the island of St. Brendan somewhere west of the Canaries. A Spanish map from 1375 marked it with the note, "Here did the blessed Brendan find peace." For cartographers, it became a convenient placeholder, an explanation for the unknown. Even Columbus may have read the Navigatio. Some scholars believe he carried a copy on his voyages. If true, that means he didn't just sail toward India, he sailed in the direction of legend. Not entirely unlike chasing Atlantis with a better flag. You lean on the rail of Brendan's imaginary ship as dolphins leap nearby. Or are they monks in disguise? One chapter suggests Brendan met sea monks, creatures that chanted in the deep and guided his boat during storms. Another says he landed on an island of monks who never aged, never ate, and glowed faintly in the moonlight. You ask a scholar, later, what he thinks of all this. He grins. It's fake news, but it's the good kind, the kind that inspires. Even skeptics admit the tale had legs, literal and metaphorical. Irish monks were among the most daring seafarers of their time. There's archaeological evidence of Irish settlements on Scottish and even Faroese Islands long before Viking expansion. Could one of them have reached Greenland? Maybe even North America? A few researchers suggest St. Brendan might have been the first European to spot the New World. They point to a strange passage describing a great land, full of rivers and trees, where the sun sets slowly. Newfoundland, perhaps? Or just another metaphor? We may never know. But Brendan's name lived on. Centuries later, explorers named ships after him. Irish nationalists cited him as proof of Celtic greatness. Poets reimagined his voyage as a dream of eternity. And modern reenactors even recreated the journey, building a leather boat and sailing from Ireland to America. It took them months, but they made it. You close your eyes now as Brendan and his monks finally reach their destination. a shimmering island cloaked in mist, where flowers sing and time doesn't pass. They kneel, they pray, and then they return. They leave paradise to tell the tale. Because in the end, Brendan's journey wasn't about proving the world was round or finding gold. It was about the power of a story, a beautiful, ridiculous, divine fiction that sailed further than any ship ever had. And whether it was real or not, it became truth to those who believed. The village square smells like hay and something worse. You push through a crowd gathered around a wooden platform where a trial is about to begin. The judge looks irritated, the bailiff confused, and the defendant is a goose. Yes, a literal goose. Feathers fluffed, beady eyes defiant, bound by twine at the feet. Tonight, you've waddled into one of medieval Europe's most peculiar expressions of justice, animal trials. And at the feathery heart of many of these, a kind of fake news so earnest, so detailed, and so incredibly absurd that no one thought to question it. The charges vary. Theft, blasphemy, assault. Once, a pig was charged with murder and hanged. Another time, a rooster stood trial for laying an egg, which, biologically, should not have been possible. But we'll come back to that. The goose on trial today is accused of stealing bread. The baker testifies, gesturing angrily. It took it right from my tray. Looked me dead in the eye. Malice was clear. The crowd murmurs. One old woman clutches her crucifix. The goose honks. Loudly. The judge frowns. Silence, prisoner. This isn't a joke. In parts of medieval France, Switzerland, and Italy, animals, especially pigs, cows, and birds, could be formally tried in court, with lawyers, witnesses, sentencing, all performed with absolute seriousness. You sit beside a local notary who shows you the official indictment, written in flawless Latin. It names the goose, assigns a case number, and calls for divine justice. You try to keep a straight face. He doesn't. He's been writing these for years. Historians still debate the why. Was it theater? Law? Religion? Probably all three. In some cases, it may have been about reinforcing divine order, symbolically punishing the disruption of God's hierarchy. In others, it was about catharsis, a community's anger funneled into a ritual they could understand and control. One famous trial in 1386 saw a sow executed in Falaise, Normandy, for mauling a child. Not only was the pig hanged, it was dressed in human clothes. The trial included testimony, a public verdict, and even a moral lesson for the townspeople. Crime must be punished, regardless of species. You sit now with a friar who's writing a sermon based on that very story. Justice is blind, he says, and should be so, even when justice is looking at a pig in a bonnet. Not all trials ended in death. Sometimes, the animal was banished. In 1519, a group of weevils was ordered to leave a vineyard or face consequences. A lawyer actually represented them, arguing that the vineyard belonged to God, and the weevils had as much right to it as humans. The court compromised. A nearby patch of land was granted to the weevils. Historians remain baffled. You now flip through an old legal codex containing a section titled, On the Proper Disposition of Heretical Chickens. One case recounts the aforementioned egg-laying rooster in Basel. Authorities feared it was the work of the devil. Roosters don't lay eggs, after all, except in very rare biological flukes. The egg was destroyed. The rooster was burned at the stake. You'd think that might raise questions. Instead, it raised fear. And wherever there was fear, there was fake news. Villagers begin repeating stories. My neighbor saw a fox recite a prayer before stealing a goose. A goat walked backward across a grave. It's cursed now. That cow's milk is sour. It must be possessed. Suddenly, livestock trials start to make sense. They offered narrative. Explanations. A pig kills a child? Tragedy. A pig tried and punished for murder? Justice. Closure. Morality reasserted. You walk past a house where a donkey stands tied to a post. A sign around its neck reads, Awaiting trial. A local boy tells you it kicked the mayor's niece. He says it was political, the boy whispers. You don't ask follow-ups. It wasn't just individual animals. In the 16th century, entire swarms of pests were tried. Locusts, mice, caterpillars. They were accused of despoiling fields and summoned, by bell and proclamation, to appear in court. Unsurprisingly, They didn't show up. So the trials proceeded anyway, often ending in excommunication of the entire species. You stand at one such trial in Lausanne, where a monk solemnly reads the verdict to a hill. Let them depart henceforth. Silence. The wind answers. One jurist you meet confesses he once had to defend a beetle infestation. He prepared a whole speech comparing the insects to biblical plagues, and still lost. They exiled the bugs, he sighs. From the forest. The forest. Of course, these trials weren't just about animals. They were about humans projecting meaning, order, and fear into a chaotic world. A world where famine, death, and disease struck without warning. If blaming a goose helped restore balance, people were more than happy to do it. Sometimes, animal trials were cover for more sinister agendas. A butcher's pig kills a child? The trial provides a distraction and prevents questions about supervision. A noble's prized cow destroys a villager's fence? Try the cow, not the noble. Justice, sanitized through absurdity. But perhaps the strangest element is how earnest it all was. These weren't Monty Python sketches. They were deeply rooted rituals. Livestock trials mirrored human ones, with the same language, the same solemnity, even the same punishments. You sit once more in the village square, the goose trial concluding. The verdict? Guilty. Sentence. 3 days of tethered shaming and a donation to the parish. The goose honks one last time and flaps its wings. A small child cheers. Someone hands out bread. The baker nods, satisfied. And you wonder, in a world where truth was fragile, where law and myth danced together, where fear made people reach for meaning, maybe putting a goose on trial wasn't that strange after all. It was just medieval fake news in feathers and twine. You're sitting in a chilly stone library now, far from the fires and feast halls, leafing through a thick, dust-coated chronicle. Its pages are stiff with age. The Latin is crooked, faded, and overwritten in places by later scribes. Some of it seems suspiciously clean. Other sections? Just plain weird. Tonight, you're tracing how all these lies, monks' revisions, fake popes, goat trials, and blood-drinking relics, became history. Not legend. Not rumor. History. The kind carved into plaques and quoted by kings. You run your finger down a parchment entry from the 11th century. It recounts a battle. Glorious. Righteous. Heaven-sent. But something's off. The casualty numbers are inflated. A storm appears conveniently. The winning side glows, literally glows, in the account. Sounds suspiciously like a bedtime story. You check another chronicle. The same battle, told differently. No storm. No glowing. Fewer dead. It seems the monks in 2 abbeys couldn't agree on who started it, or who won. But both versions survived. Both were copied, stored, cited. And now, hundreds of years later, no one remembers which one was real. This is the fragile truth of medieval record-keeping. Your history was only as accurate as the last guy who copied it, or rewrote it under pressure. You meet a young scribe who shows you a parchment palimpsest, an old manuscript scraped clean and rewritten. Under the visible text, faint traces of a previous entry linger. It seems to be about a queen scandal. The rewritten version? A saint's miracle. You smile. Clever cover-up. Historians still argue whether such revisions were deliberate erasures or just practical reuse of precious vellum. But when you erase the ink, you also erase the memory. And what replaces it becomes the new truth. You visit a town where locals proudly point to a mural of St. Cuthwin slaying a sea serpent. It's colorful, detailed, and based on nothing. No official account. No relic. Just a 14th century poem written by a bored monk who was trying to impress his patron. The town built its identity around it. They hold a festival every year. Children wear serpent hats. There's a parade. No one questions it. Why would they? It's always been true. Even kings got in on the action. One ruler had a chronicle written claiming he was visited in a dream by Charlemagne, who told him to expand his territory. The vision conveniently aligned with an upcoming invasion. The chronicler included exact dialogue. In Latin, with dramatic pauses. You ask another monk, older and more skeptical, how he knows what's real. He shrugs. If it's written in 3 books, it's true. If it's in 1, it might be true. If it's in none, maybe it should be. That last part sticks with you. Because medieval truth wasn't about evidence. It was about continuity. If a lie lasted long enough, it became tradition. And tradition calcified into fact. You flip to a record of a plague in 1282. It blames it on sky dragons with venomous breath. A note in the margin reads, "Consulted 3 witnesses." No one questioned it. Why? Because it felt reasonable at the time. People died. The dragons explained it. No further questions. One of the most surreal entries you find is in a royal genealogy that includes a man named Theobald the Ghostborn, so named because, allegedly, his mother was haunted by the spirit of St. Luke for 9 months. He's now in several noble family trees. Some websites still list him today. The ghost baby lived a full life, by the way. Served in Parliament. Owned goats. Eventually, scribes stopped flagging inconsistencies. Not because they believed the stories, but because the stories worked. They filled gaps, answered questions, smoothed over contradictions. You sit at a wooden desk copying a battle map. The original is long gone. You're using a copy of a copy, traced over twice and corrected by a monk who had never seen the region in question. He adjusted a river for aesthetic flow. That river now appears in atlases. Truth, adjusted for beauty. Even saints' lives were rewritten posthumously to fit new expectations. A peaceful hermit becomes a fiery preacher. A sickly monk gains muscles and a sword. An obscure relic gets rediscovered under mysterious circumstances just in time to boost a struggling abbey's pilgrimage traffic. You lean on a windowsill and gaze down at a city square where a statue of Queen Isabel the Just stands tall. According to the plaque, she ended a famine, tamed wolves, and healed 3 blind children with her tears. The actual Isabel was exiled for tax evasion. But her myth stuck, because it felt better. And so, over time, the world was redrawn, not by facts, but by feelings carved into marble. You open one last book, its cover cracked and flaking. Inside is a list of miracles, signed by bishops, kings, and scholars. Some are natural phenomena misunderstood. Others are outright fabrications. But all of them believed. That belief gave them weight. Not because they were real, but because they were written, remembered, repeated. And once something is repeated enough, no matter how absurd, it becomes part of the world. So here you are. After 15 sections of medieval misinformation, dragons, popes, pig trials, and powdered emeralds, you find yourself back where you started. Not surrounded by liars, but by storytellers. Trying, in their flawed, frightened, and funny way, to make sense of the chaos around them. And in doing so, they left us a history not of what happened, but of what people needed to believe. Underscore. So now, dear traveler, you can close the books. Let the scrolls roll themselves back up. The candles in the scriptorium gutter out. Outside, the town square is quiet. Even the goose has gone to sleep. Let your mind slow, like the fading echo of a monk's chant in an empty cloister. What we've wandered through together wasn't just about lies. It was about longing. A longing for meaning, for order, for a world that could be explained. Even if the explanations were stitched together from dragon scales and saintly shoelaces. You've seen how fake popes and phantom armies, angelic bishops, and aromatic plague cures weren't simply mistakes. They were humanity's way of coping, of reaching for truth with muddy hands and ink-stained fingers. And maybe that's still true today in quieter ways. Maybe it's why we tell stories, why we look at the stars and imagine more than gas and gravity, why we give meaning to feathers, bones, and whispered dreams. Now, as you rest your head, the parchment of your thoughts softens. The monks sleep. The false treaties curl beside the hearth. The sea settles, Brendan's boat gently bobbing on imaginary waves. You've wandered through a world of wonder, mischief, and mistaken belief, and you've come out the other side with something far better than cold facts. You've come out with warmth. So drift gently now. Let the darkness curl around you like a velvet hood. History will still be here in the morning. And the goose, for what it's worth, was probably innocent. Sweet dreams.